Today's tutorial is about MOPs plus d-intersect. This is a handy little utility node that quickly separates piles of objects using the bullet solver. D-intersect uses a well-known trick inside the bullet solver to force objects apart. This means that your input objects need to be packed primitives in order to work. MOPs plus collision geo is perfect for handling this. You can then use the Constraints tab to optionally lock the position or orientation of the pieces while de-intersecting them. You can also provide a polygon geometry or an SDF volume and lock the pieces to the surface or inside the volume, or use the geometry as a static collider to better tailor the results. Okay, let's start with a really simple example. This TETS object here is from the d-intersect.hip that comes in the examples folder with MOPs plus, and all this is just a bunch of little Tetris pieces. I've got a line, an L, a T, a Z, and a square, just all the stuff that you'd expect as far as Tetris pieces goes. These are just useful test geometries for examining the d-intersect process. You can use them if you want. If you don't, use something else. Doesn't matter to me. I'm going to drop down a new geometry container, and then I'm going to object merge the results of those Tetris pieces into this object. Okay, and now that I've got all these in here, I'm going to drop down a MOPs instancer. Just wire all these in. Now let's take the global transform down to about a tenth the size that it is, and then I'm going to change my distribution to, let's do a fixed number and just do a 10 by 10 by 10. So we've got 1,000 primitives here. Now to make this a little bit more interesting, let's randomize the orientation. I have a slightly more interesting starting position, and now if I wanted to de-intersect these as is, I wouldn't get particularly good results, and that's because a lot of these pieces are convex. If I look at the L shape, for example, this diagonal here between this corner point and this point would be filled if this were made entirely into a convex hull. So in order to fix that, I'm just going to run this through MOPs collision geo first. If you haven't already done the tutorial for this node, I'll link it below, but it comes in handy when you're doing anything involving bullet, which includes MOPs Deintersect. So running this through collision geo, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit closer here, and you can see that it kind of takes some chunks out of the sides here. It's probably not a big deal unless you need really, really good accuracy. I'm just going to turn on preview segments here so I can see this a little bit more clearly. And the remeshing process is getting a little bit confused because of the bevels that are on these things. So I can remesh a little bit less, maybe turn the triangle size down. Okay, and now I'm getting pretty good results just by reducing the triangle size on this. So this is probably good to go as is. I'm just going to turn off preview segments, and now we're ready to de-intersect. The original geometry goes in the first input, and then you can optionally apply proxy geometry to the second input. And now it's going to try and solve that. Let's see, by default, it's going to do up to 50 iterations. And you can see it's done a reasonably good job. There's a few things here that are still getting stuck, and we're going to have to address that, but otherwise this is mostly working. So one way that you can easily debug sims like this is to go to the simulation tab, and instead of just doing a fixed number of iterations, because d-intersect is just supposed to give you a static frame. It's not supposed to actually animate this. But if it helps to see it animated, what you can do is just use an expression for max iterations. And I usually just use frame -1. And what this means is that I can actually just scrub the timeline and watch this thing push the objects apart over time. So because I'm having a bit of a rough time here with some of these pieces not separating, you know, these guys in here are overlapping a bit, because my overall point scale is about 1/10 of what it normally is, and the default collision padding leaves you about 1 centimeter of padding in between these objects, that for the most part, that's about the same amount of penetration that I'm seeing between these things. There's not too many others that are attached to each other more than that. So I'm just going to drop my collision padding by about 1/10 and then rerun the simulation up to this point and see what that does. And this is actually looking pretty good. I don't see any obvious issues here. As far as the outputs go, if you wanted to then take this pile and run this directly into some kind of simulation, whether it's a MOP simulation or standard DOPS physics, you have both outputs ready for you here. So the input that we're looking right now, or the output that we're looking at right now is the packed primitives themselves. But if we need that proxy geometry again for a sim, it's right here, coming out of the second input, ready to go. Now I'm just going to rewind really quick. And let's say that I don't randomize these and I want to push these things apart, but I don't want them to change their orientation. I like things being nice and ordered like this. On the MOPs Deintersect, I can just go to constraints and then select either lock position or lock orientation. So let's just say lock orientation on this. And now when I step through the sim, they're going to break apart, but they're never going to spin. And so you can get slightly more interesting results out of this just by preventing these things from spinning around. I'm just going to hit stop here, because that looks like it's probably enough iterations. And this is a little bit hard to read, so why don't I just apply a color stop here, put this on the original geometry, and just randomize this. And now each packed primitive has a random color, and this looks like it's doing a pretty good job. I don't see any obvious penetration between any of these hulls. And again, I could go back to d-intersect and do the same thing for position instead if I just wanted these things to spin in place and not move. Okay, let's do a slightly more involved example. This time I'm going to lock the geometry to a surface and show you how to control that. So let's make a new geometry container. I'm just going to jump back into this original network and grab these object merges so I don't have to type that in again. So here's my merges, and then I'm going to again make a MOPs instancer and wire all these guys in. Now, instead of instancing in a grid, I'm going to create a sphere that I want to instance these things directly onto. Make it a polygon sphere. And I'm just going to attach a null that I can use as the instance template just in case I have to do anything to this sphere ahead of time. And then on the distribution tab, I'm going to go to distribution type mesh and then pick my null as the template object. And then let's start by scattering, about 160 of these guys, maybe 150. Okay, so they're randomly scattered on there. They're obviously way too big, so let's take our global transform down to 0.1. And now we've got all these guys sticking out of this sphere. I'm going to template that just so we have a clearer view. Again, let's randomize the orientation here so we get a slightly more interesting starting configuration. And okay, that looks good. And we've already got some of these pieces overlapping each other, so this should be a pretty good demo. Now, same thing as before, I'm going to grab the MOPs collision geo node. And then I'm going to preview segments, turn this on. So yeah, let's turn the remesh iterations down to 1 and then reduce our triangle size. That's looking pretty good. Turn off preview segments. And now let's run this through d-intersect. So with the default settings, it's already pretty simple. There's not that much interpenetration going on here, and also there's a lot less primitives than before. So they split apart pretty easily. But what if I want these things to actually sit on the surface and kind of conform to its orientation and position? Right now it's not doing anything, they're just de-intersecting, but I might want these things to stay on the surface. For example, if I have a bunch of objects that are on a terrain of some kind and I want them to push apart from each other but not actually leave the surface, I can turn on lock position or lock orientation, or I can lock to an actual input. I'm going to need something going in there, so I'm going to take this sphere and just connect it to constraint geometry or SDF volume. That's the third input. And now this unlocks and I can set this to geometry. Now when I run the simulation, let's just, again, set max iterations to frame -1 so we can see this happening over time, and then reset. What we're going to see is that these pieces are going to separate, but they're also going to stay locked to the surface. And that might be more visible if we increase the number of instances that we're dealing with here. So let's go to distribute, and then I'm going to set this to, let's do 250, and then reset the simulation. So now we have a lot more of these, and you can see that they're sliding around, but they're staying stuck to the sphere as they do this. So it's going to take a few more iterations because we've got more pieces crowding this. But you can see that as they separate, they don't just separate blindly, they're going to try and stay stuck to the surface. In addition to sticking to the surface in terms of position, we can also orient these pieces to the surface. And that means that the orientation of the packed primitives is going to try and match the orientation of the points that they're stuck to, or the position on the mesh that they're stuck to. To do that, I actually need an orientation on this mesh, so I'm going to use a MOPs orient mesh node to just quickly create that. I'm going to go back here and just visualize the up vector, and you can see that by default, it's doing a reasonably good job. I have n and up vectors here that more or less make sense. If I want everything to be pointing sort of as aligned to the ground plane, instead of auto up, I can just set a fixed up vector, and then I could even cross it if I need these things to like smoothly go around. It's up to you how you want the orientation to work. Usually crossing the up vector is a safe way to generate pretty stable orientations across something like a box or a sphere that is pointing in all different directions. Let's just start with this and see how it goes. So back on the d-intersect, I'm going to enable orient to surface and then reset the simulation. And you can see that things are, sticking sort of straight out in their default orientation or something similar to it. So you can see it starts like this, completely randomized, and then they try to sort of align themselves so that their N and up is more or less matching the N and up of the mesh that they're on. If for some reason you want to reverse that, you have this option to swap the two, and now you can see that they're actually going to try and lay flat on the sphere. But again, because this is a simulation, you're going to have to go to the simulation tab and reset it to actually get it to run. So now we can drag across, and you can see that because there's a lot of these instances, it's fighting a lot harder to get these things separated. But it does do its best to kind of evenly distribute these. There may be too many pieces to actually do a perfect distribution on the sphere. So in order to get this to settle out, you might need to actually reduce the number of instances or scale them down slightly. If I go to the global transform and drop this to like maybe 0.08, and then reset the simulation again, this might give us a distribution that actually works. Yeah, that's a little better. So you can see it's only fighting for a little bit, and then it quickly settles out. Okay, onto something slightly more advanced. I'm going to drop down another geometry container. And then again, let's just paste those merge nodes down so we have our Tetris pieces. And I'll drop these into an instance here, but I'm not going to do anything with it just yet. Next, I'm going to make a sphere. Just flag on this, make it a polygon with a frequency of about 5, and then flip. And what I'm going to do with this is make ourselves a little serial bowl for some Tetris cereal. So it is below the plane, so here's our bowl. And just for my own OCD, I'm going to use match size to move this so that it's sitting above the ground plane. Just makes me feel better. And there we go. Next, I'm going to poly-extrude this by, let's say, about 0.05. So now I've got this bowl shape that has a little bit of thickness so I can use it for collisions. Okay, now I want to fill this cereal bowl with Tetris pieces, and the easiest way to do that is by specifying a volume. So I'm going to just jump back up before I did this poly-extrude. And for the separate part of the network, I'm just going to use a poly-fill, and that's going to draw a little cap across the end here. So now I have like a filled volume here that now I can create a VDB from. So VDB from polygons. And now I have this volume that I can use to actually scatter in. I'm just going to fill interior to make that easier. And now I can scatter points directly into this volume. And these are going to be the points that I eventually tell the instancer to instance to. Now this is an SDF, which I do not want to scatter directly to, so I'm going to use a convert VDB to convert this scatter volume, because I'm going to want that SDF later. I'm going to convert this to VDB of type fog, so convert SDF to fog. And now when I'm scattering, it's actually scattering inside this volume. Let's turn on the template geometry so you can see it. So the only thing that's a kind of a downer here is that there's still some scattered points here that are outside the bowl. So again, before I convert the VDB, but after I make the VDB from polygons, I'm going to use a VDB reshape SDF and just erode the VDB by about 1 voxel. Looks like it's enough. So now I have like a nice safe margin between where the pieces are going to spawn and the bowl itself. And let's just drop down a null to make this a little bit more organized. And this is going to be my scatter points. Okay, now back up to the instancer. Let's turn this on and then tell it under distribution. I'm going to, and again, this is basically copy to points at this point. It's just handling the randomization of the pieces automatically. If you prefer using copy to points and the variant workflow there to scatter different kinds of pieces, that's also totally fine. MOPS really doesn't care. As long as you have name and ID attributes on everything, it'll be interchangeable with anything else in Houdini. So I'm going to set this to mesh, and then my distribution type is going to be points. So now it's actually just going to instance directly onto those points as soon as I pick template geometry. So let's just drag it up here. And that's way too big, so let's shrink those down. I'm going to set my global transform to 0.1. And there's all my pieces in there. That's probably way more than I'm going to be able to fit in that bowl. So let's go back to the scatter here and let's try something a little bit more reasonable, like 200. We should be able to fit those in there with like a little bit of spill coming. Okay, let's randomize these like we have been so that we get a more interesting starting pattern for distribution. I'm going to randomize orientation. That looks pretty good. Okay, and now let's prep these guys for collision. So as always, MOPs collision geo. Let's turn the remesh iterations to 1, turn the triangle size down a bit so we get slightly more accurate pieces. Those look pretty good. And now let's run d-intersect. Just going to spread this network out a bit because we're going to need the room. Okay, so collision geo in the second input, the original geo in the first, and when we run the d-intersect by default, it's going to do about 50 iterations, and it just pops everything out. And this is a good starting point, but obviously we want these things to collide with the bowl for the right effect, so we're going to have to start integrating this extruded bowl into this sim somehow. And the fourth input here for static colliders is what's going to handle that. Now, static colliders are still effectively bullet objects, and so in order to make this work, we need to take this extruded bowl here and turn this into a valid bullet object. And we can actually just use MOPs collision geo again to handle that. All we need to do first is assemble this guy into a packed primitive of some kind, because MOPs collision geo only wants to work on packed primitives. So I'm just going to create packed geometry here and then wire this into collision geo. And now, you know, this is pretty ugly, but we can start working from here. I'm going to go to my collision geo, and I'm actually going to just disable remeshing on this entirely and start from what we already have. And then let's just bring our max concavity down, 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 down until we get something that starts looking a little bit more like the bowl. Let's preview segments so we get a better example here. Yeah, that's not great, so let's keep going down. Let's try disabling treat as solid. There we go, that's what we needed. So I'm going to drop this down just a little bit further, maybe 0.15. And now we have something that is a little bit ugly, but it's roughly the outline of the bowl, and because these are convex hulls, they'll collide perfectly with the rest of the sim. So I'm just going to, well, I can leave preview segments on, that's fine. And let's wire this in as the static colliders, and then run the sim again. So I'm just going to reset this. Okay, it's getting there, but it's still having trouble with some of these pieces that really don't want to be inside that bowl there. I can try and run more iterations. Maybe we can turn this up to 100 and see if it behaves better, but I'm guessing it's still not going to like this much. Yeah, this sim is still going to need a little bit of help. Okay, this is extremely silly, but I just realized that the reason why I'm not getting the collisions I want is because when I extruded this bowl, I conveniently forgot to actually output the back. Now I'm going to get proper hulls, and with a little bit more work, I can actually probably get good collisions. So let's again check MOPs collision geo here and confirm, yep, got convex hulls. Okay, and now back to d-intersect. For debugging purposes, I'm going to do what I always do and change this to frame 1, so I can actually see these guys d-intersect, and let's template. I guess this guy is already templated, but maybe we want to template the extruded version. And mostly we're getting good results. So there's a few pieces that are getting pushed to the outside here, but it's because they might be like a little bit outside of the bowl, and it's deciding, well, I'm stuck halfway inside this bowl, but it's easier for me to push outwards, so I'm just going to push outwards. So these things get removed entirely. There's a couple of different ways we can handle this. One of them is to use the volume constraint, which I'll show in a minute, and the other is to just make the walls of this thing thicker for simulation purposes. So just to show you that latter solution really quick, if I just change my extrusion depth to like 0.2 so that it's real thick, now we've got ourselves a molcajete, I can scroll back and rerun the sim, and a lot less of these pieces are going to get pushed out. I still have this annoying line that's misbehaving here. Maybe I need to get a little bit further out. Let's do 0.3 and then run the sim again, and now everything is fitting inside. And of course, this doesn't have to be the bowl that I'm actually using for rendering. I can go back and have a separate bowl for rendering, and the collisions will be fine. So that's one way to solve this kind of problem. And you can see that now we get this nice little pile that actually, because it's colliding with this, it nicely piles up outside the bowl and kind of pushes up over the top. So now that we've proven this, I'm going to turn the distance back to 0.05, and let's try an alternative method. So back here, again, I have this nice reshaped VDB that might be a pretty useful containment volume for these guys. what I can do is use this VDB as a constraint volume. So if I attach this to the third input, and then under constraints, if I go to locked input SDF volume, it's going to want a volume name, which by default is surface, the same you get from any VDB. And now when I run this simulation, let's rewind back and play this, what it's going to do is force each of these objects to exist inside that volume. Now, this is kind of a hacky way of doing it because outside of Bullet Engine, I don't have any way of really doing accurate volume collisions or checking whether something is in a volume. I can only check based on the packed points. So this is going to make sure that each packed point is inside that volume, and then you're kind of relying on the collisions to handle everything else. So if I hit play from here, you're going to get some weirdness at the beginning here while it's trying to make sure that all of these things are inside. But eventually, right at the end there, you can see that it slips in. And they're not peeking over the bowl as much anymore because this volume is, again, not actually going over the bowl here. But it is doing a pretty good job at containing these things within that defined volume and paying attention to the collisions as it does so. So after enough iterations, this last guy gets inside and everything is nicely packed in and we don't have to adjust the collision geo at all. And so now we have our nice little bowl of Tetris pieces. Maybe we can visualize them to make them a little bit easier to look at. Let's say, we could randomize the color, maybe use it on set mode, and then just sort of pick, like pick some random greens. There we go. Now we have this really appetizing looking bowl of Tetris cereal that we can merge in here with our bowl. Give this guy some color. And then merge it in here at the end, and here's our final. Normal for this too. Perfect, it's beautiful, done. So again, with the output from this, what I could do is maybe cache it or cache it to disk, and then put this directly into some other sim or leave it as is. So you can use this as the initial conditions for something, or you can just use this to create, fairly believable looking piles of things, or otherwise organize objects in a way that looks somewhat physically realistic because you don't get all kinds of overlaps everywhere. It's a simple little node, but it can be a convenient way of solving some otherwise annoying simulation problems. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon.